I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder. This is the podcast where we try to find order in our mad world. And boy, this episode is going to be particularly mad because we are going to be exploring one of the biggest conspiracy theories of them all. Do aliens exist? And has there been a multi-decade government cover-up to conceal the evidence?
Yep, that's right, dear listeners. Today we get to order the disorder, not just of our paltry terrestrial planet, but of the whole cosmos, and ask the really small questions that we love on this pod, such as, have aliens been coming to Earth? Do they control Alex Hall's brain? Is there information about this question that world governments have been systematically hiding from their populace? And can humans work together to pool information and expertise and then carry out compromises to arrive at mutually beneficial solutions?
Jason, I think they've taken over your brain, not mine.
When it comes to working together to face external challenges, really no challenge could be more existential than any threat that might emanate from extraterrestrial life. And when it comes to opportunities for progress, no potential gain could be greater than from learning from extraterrestrial technologies. Hence, in the face of such a threat or such an opportunity, the Bedouin proverb should apply: me and my cousin and I against the outsider. This should mean that in the face of non-terrestrial challenges and opportunities, Russians and Americans and Chinese and Catholics and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims should all work together. But do you really think Republicans and Democrats, Brexiteers and social justice warriors will actually rally together? I haven't seen it yet. Now, this so far might seem like a very theoretical discussion, but the discussion is rather less theoretical than most people may realize.
In 2023, a whistleblower addressed Congress. Air Force Colonel David Grusch came before Congress to present his first-hand evidence of alien spacecraft remains. According to this theory, parts of the US government may have been hiding evidence of non-human biologics and UAPs, that is, unexplained aerial phenomena, the new term for what used to be called UFOs, that they've been hiding this evidence from other parts of the United States government and from Congress. For more on the exact facts and chronology of this case, as well as the Senate's hearings and legislation follow-up, please follow the links in the show notes. Last year, the Democrat-controlled Senate passed an act, the UAP Disclosure Act, mandating the government to reveal what it knows. But the key aspects of this legislation are being blocked in the Republican-controlled House. And I have to reveal here, I had no idea about any of this story until Jason chose to address it in this podcast today.
And I want to be really clear at the outset. I am not an expert on this story. I've done a lot of reading over the last 2 months, but I know that we need to approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism. What is known is that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer led the passing of the UAP Disclosure Act unanimously in the Senate. And he gave a speech with his Republican colleagues where they both said it's important to compel the rest of government to disclose what they know about this phenomenon to Congress. One should approach a story like this very seriously when we have accomplished and experienced people like Colonel Grusch or our guest today who want to call attention to various facts and various discrepancies. We may not believe everything they say or how they draw implications, but we need to pay close attention to what this phenomenon might reveal, not only about UAPs and non-human biologics, but to the issues that definitely are true, which is the ways in which government institutions do not share information with other entities optimally, and they do not necessarily coordinate seamlessly together. It's this coordination failure, transparency failure aspect of the story, which is very appropriate for us here on Disorder. It's an enduring disorder phenomenon.
Yeah, so I have to confess here that I personally don't believe in UAPs or UFOs. It's not that I don't believe at all in the possibility of alien life. I think there's quite a good chance there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, simply given the sheer size of the cosmos. But I still listened to today's interview with a lot of skepticism, and I came away from it still a bit unconvinced about the existence of UFOs and a secretive government cover-up. Nevertheless, there is a question. Why did Congress, the United States Senate, actually pass an act if there's nothing there at all? The other interesting thing about the interview you're about to hear is the question about whether there is some kind of secretive deep state, or to use our guest's terminology, a shadow government that is deliberately concealing information for us, or even plotting behind the scenes for more nefarious purposes. I have to say, I'm skeptical about our guest's views on this, but it is highly relevant given the current conspiratorial climate in the US, where conspiracy theorists are running wild. For example, there are Democrat-run child pedophilia rings, that the Kansas City Chiefs' victory in the recent Super Bowl was all part of an elaborate plot to back Joe Biden, or that the COVID vaccine was part of a secretive government attempt to take over our bodies. What is true is there are some really mad people out there in this world.
Alex, if the Pentagon has made the Kansas City Chiefs win the Super Bowl, they've really done a great job, not only bionically engineering Patrick Mahomes' arm, but in his ability to read defenses and always throwing the ball to the guy that's open. I mean, this is like next level stuff.
And also, I'm really pissed off because I wanted the Baltimore Ravens to win this time.
I would have preferred that too, Alex. We're on the same page there. What I want to wonder then is, with Bob Kraft and all his billions, why is he not able to use the same artificial intelligence to bionically engineer a younger Tom Brady? If DOD can do it, I don't get why Kraft is not able to produce a new, Tom Brady in his early 30s.
If the Pentagon was able to engineer Patrick Mahomes, I also want them to re-engineer Roger Federer. I want him back winning Wimbledon, please, Pentagon, if you're listening to this.
Yeah, we like grace and classic beauty and a few good sliced backhands. Joking aside, I think you explained that super well, that my understanding of the size of the galaxy makes me believe that there could also be alien intelligence somewhere in the galaxy. What I struggle to believe is that the US government could successfully conceal something as potentially earth-shattering as it being in possession of an alien spacecraft, and then maintain that cover-up over multiple administrations, multiple decades, with lots of different personnel change and institutional cultural change. How I have worked with governments, I don't see that as possible. Nixon couldn't keep the Watergate tapes secret for even a few years. The fact that Reagan had dementia, they wanted to keep that secret, and it got out, right? So I just don't see the US government as capable of having a sophisticated, massive cover-up of something of these proportions, right? It is for this reason that I reached out to Daniel Sheehan. He's the head of the New Paradigm Institute. Daniel holds certain views that might seem controversial to many, yet it's really important to stress that Daniel has as sterling a CV as any of the guests we've had on this podcast. He has multiple degrees from Harvard University. He's an accomplished and acclaimed civil rights lawyer. He's worked on Watergate, 3 Mile Island, and Iran-Contra. So before delving into Daniel's words, I think it's critical that we lay out the agenda of his institute.
Right. So I'm going to quote from the website of the New Paradigm Institute that Daniel founded. The mission is, inverted commas, to inform the public of the true facts surrounding UFOs/UAPs and to mobilize them to secure full and responsible disclosure of the information about UFO technology and non-human intelligent visitors held in secret from Congress for 80 years by the military intelligence aerospace industry complex. End quote.
So, Alex, what I take the meaning of this statement of the New Paradigm Institute is that they see the UAP phenomenon as part and parcel of global coordination failures, and they seek to encourage global transparency and coordination. Their mission statement calls for, and again, I quote from their website, global collaboration. The issue of UAP transcends national borders. It is a global mystery that requires global solutions. By pushing for disclosure, we are advocating for international cooperation and dialogue. We seek a global treaty for disassembling nuclear weapons and using space technology for only peaceful purposes benefiting all humanity. End quote. So with that rather long preamble out of the way, let's finally jump into this really complicated topic. I began asking Daniel to bring us up to date with the latest developments in the UAP disclosure cases before the United States Congress.
Both Republicans and Democrats alike, all were supportive of having a 64-page law passed, setting up a controlled disclosure campaign to reveal the information that our deep programs know about the UFO phenomenon, or the UAP phenomenon as they referred to it. And all of that information was to be turned over within 300 days of the passage of the statute. And when that bill was sent over to the House of Representatives, 99% of all of the people there all agreed with this, and so did their House members. And it was only this individual from the 10th Congressional District in Ohio, who was the chair of the House Intelligence Committee. His name is Michael Turner. He happens to come from the district where the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is located. And we know that that is the base of the major field office of a private aerospace corporation that is called Radiance Technologies, that is attempting to back engineer the technology from that and other such craft to make a weapon system for the United States.
Why don't we discuss first the media and the electoral implications before zooming out more about issues of the military-industrial complex and collaboration and coordination failures. So to just start with the media, why in your mind has this been covered by News Nation? And, yes, there are some Guardian op-eds about it here in the UK, but it's not front page in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal every day. But this issue is about the future of humanity and our relationship to the rest of the solar system. How do you understand its lack of cut through into the news cycle?
As we know, Jason, that since at least July of 1947, there has been in operation here in our country, and in effect throughout the whole world, a major covert operation to suppress this information. Initially, for the very reason that they wanted to back engineer the technology of this craft that they recovered in July of 1947 to potentially develop a weapons system, at least all the way up until December 31st of 1991, when the Soviet Union voluntarily dissolved.
Yes.
And at that point, there was no longer that rationale for trying to develop a weapon because there was some perceived dialectical threat from the Soviet Union. But the problem was that what happened is immediately, the Monday morning following December 31st of 1991, when President Gorbachev dissolved the Soviet Union, the Defense Department of the administration of George Bush Sr. convened a meeting in the West Wing of the White House, and they were confronted with the challenge that they were going to have to be confronted by a demand to reduce our massive military budget, that we were spending over $700 billion a year for decades, pursuant to the rationale that the Soviet Union was super powerful. And now that the Soviet Union was dissolving as a unit, they realized that there was going to be an upsurge of demand on the part of our citizens to stop spending that massive percentage of our budget every year on military. And so this group came together. They prepared the 1992 United States Defense Department policy planning guidance document. And in that document, they said, we have to push back against this movement to reduce our massive military budget, because we are standing on the brink of being able to establish full spectrum military dominance over the planet. And we're going to be able to use that power to secure and maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by our nation. They did exactly the opposite of what should have happened at that time, of trying to establish a completely peaceful relationship and prosperous cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union, or the Russia now.
What I want to ask you about more specifically is your interactions with Gorbachev. You met him.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the Russians at different times were the world leaders in aeronautics. They were maybe third or fourth by the 1980s. What were you able to know about their perspective?
So we had face-to-face set of meetings with Gorbachev, and got Gorbachev to agree that he would, when he became president, start to open up the discussions to start disassembling the nuclear warheads of both Russia and the United States. And that's the process that Gorbachev began. My first conversation with him, when he took out of his pocket a little notepad and he wrote down a telephone number on it and handed it to me. I called the telephone number, and this was a close personal friend of Gorbachev's, who happened to be the editor-in-chief of the only Hebrew language newspaper. And I met with him, and he conveyed the story to me about an event that took place in Russia at a major park outside of Moscow, and a major UFO appeared right over the park. And a one man walked out underneath it, trying to communicate with it, and this bright blue light came out of the bottom of the craft and enveloped this guy, and he just ascended up into the craft. And then it flew away, and everybody was running around like mad. It was before cell phones. And they scrambled to try to get communications out about this, and someone called their newspaper and told them that this had happened. And so he dispatched one of their reporters right away to get out to the site where this had happened and started interviewing people. And while he was there, the craft came back, and this beam of light came out of the bottom, and the man kind of slowly descended back down to the ground, and then it just shot away. And so it became an incredibly important story. And the editor-in-chief contacted Gorbachev and told him all about it. And Gorbachev and his people had set up a major program to investigate this.
So why don't we zoom out? It sounds like the idea that John Stuart Mill said, if you let the truth all be out there and you let falsehood be out there, truth will win out over falsehood.
Yes.
This is something that you believe
I do.
Humanity is able to deal with and process truth.
Yes. There are responsible roles to be played. In general, my 50-year experience in dealing, for example, with juries, you put 12 regular people into a jury box and you allow them to get the full information from both sides, they'll get to the right answer.
This is a year where I don't know if you're as terrified as we are on this Disorder podcast, but we do think that our democratic freedoms could slip away, right?
Yes,
and
it's a very dangerous time. Yeah.
How do you see this issue playing out in the US, in the UK, when we're facing these monumental elections, which are either about sharing and collaboration and a return to the functioning of our democratic systems, or the entrenching of neopopulism? How do you see this UAP issue playing out there?
My sense is that the people who are in control of this information are going to be quite careful about the process by means of which this information comes out into the system, because of the high levels of fear that exist of disrupting the process pursuant to which they believe collectively they're going to be able to successfully put down this insurrection.
So that's very interesting, because the thesis that you seem to be drawing on is that forces of reaction feel that knowledge not only about UAPs, but of past government cover-ups would somehow help globalists and Democrats. I fear that it wouldn't be that way, Daniel. I wish it would help, but One of the things that I have seen is that the existence of one conspiracy is an indicator that people will believe in others, right? If you present people with a list of totally seemingly unconnected conspiracies, for example, about Jews running the US government, about a cover up about aliens, it's a belief in one conspiratorial thing, which makes people more likely to believe in another. And the fact that there might be a quote unquote deep state or shadow government aspect to how this information was kept from the public before, I think could be very, very helpful to Trump. Do you know what I mean? That
Yes, I understand.
I fear that this salience of this issue, although we would like it to be something which would turn people in a globalist and coordinating direction, they won't necessarily take it that way for many electoral cycles because it's going to have an initial response. Look, I told you so. The deep state has been keeping this from us. We need to throw out the bastards and just focus on us. And us will be defined in a very nationalistic and reactionary way.
Extraordinarily interesting question, Jason. That is one of the very specific arguments that's being made right now to me. You know, I've had direct face-to-face sit-down conversations with people from within the national security state who make this very argument that, look, what we're talking about here is the granddaddy of all conspiracies, is their term. They're afraid that if it's revealed all at once, not only the series of lies that have been told, but the lengths to which they have gone to keep this secret, that if this were revealed, then virtually all the rest of the conspiracies will be given credence.
Of course, it would have been nicer to have just had this information released as it was known from the 40s and 50s and 60s and stuff. Like, why not? We could have all benefited in this collaborative endeavor. But maybe they are onto something, those interlocutors of you in the bowels of the national security state. What do you say to that?
I think that their perception of what the likelihood is of this is a continuation of the same kind of paranoia on their part that comes with the job that they have, thinking that their job is to protect us against some ultimate other all the time, and they live in that whole culture and they reinforce it with each other. I believe that it is only by releasing the truth about what it is that's been going on and what has been being kept secret that we can actually parse the difference between real conspiracies and false conspiracies. I'm the one that was one of the ones that helped publish the 47 volumes of the Pentagon Papers. I sat in the closed door chambers with the United States attorney that was representing the Nixon administration. He was trying to argue to the judge, well, you can't release any of the information from these 47 volumes because it'll cause catastrophic damage to the national security of the United States. And I would say to him, like, what? Like, what are we talking about here? He said, oh, I'm sorry, I can't tell you because it's classified. And the judge said, well, how about you tell me if you're asking us to issue an injunction against the New York Times to prohibit them from publishing this information? You need to tell me what it is you think is going to cause catastrophic damage. And Whitney North Seymour, who was the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, said to the judge, I'm sorry, I can't tell you either, Your Honor. You don't have the proper security clearances. And the fact of the matter is, we beat them back. And we published all 47 volumes of those things, and no catastrophic damage happened to the national security of the United States at all. It helped stop the Vietnam War because it was based on a tissue of lies. They were lying and fabricating information to try to establish a military base in Southeast Asia. That's all that they were doing. So from their perspective, it may be perceived as catastrophic, but it is not, objectively so.
What I don't necessarily agree with you on is this idea of there being a they, that they had a plan with the Vietnam War. Having worked in government and spent so much time in the Middle East, I've seen that we didn't have much of a plan in Iraq. Netanyahu certainly doesn't have a plan in Gaza. There's no conspiracy. There's just no plan. I find it difficult when I hear you say, they had a plan in the Vietnam War to establish a base in Southeast Asia and therefore this, that, and the other. As I understand it, there were less than 10 people in the entire State Department who could read Vietnamese. Many people believed in the absurd domino theory, which, doesn't make any sense at all. And a series of miscalculations ensued following on the decisions made by the French and de Gaulle in particular in Southeast Asia. Do you know what I mean? So we made a series of what I will call the cock-up theory. And
Mm-hmm.
did people benefit in Halliburton and this and that from the cock-ups around Iraq? Yes. Was there some kind of master plan to, I don't know, get the oil or whatever? Absolutely not. A series of cock-ups and a waste of blood and treasure and a great tragedy. So what I want to push back against here is I noticed that when you ran the Christic Institute, you spoke about the shadow government. I've worked
That's right.
with the government and not nearly at the high levels that you have, but I have difficulty thinking that there can be any coherent shadow government because I've dealt with the US and British governments. There are some smart people, but the institutions barely function. Do you know what I mean? They struggle to tell a guy at the other side of the hallway to tie his shoes. What is this shadow government?
I'm glad you asked, Jason. The reality is, this is much more real than you may suspect. When in 1965, I'm sitting in Gov 182 at Harvard College. I'm sitting guys from Andover and Exeter,
Yep.
and the Peabody School. And here I am, this blue collar kid coming. My dad was the first Sheehan man ever to graduate from high school. I got this big full boat scholarship to Harvard College. I said, I'm going to take advantage of this. I ended up getting recruited by the number one corporate law firm in the whole world at the time, at the Cahill Gordon firm. And I know positively what's going on. These guys meet together, talk together. They belong to the same clubs. They retreat into the back room and light up the cigars and talk to each other. And they say, look, we're smarter than everybody else. We have a right to coordinate and run the world.
I just want to clarify what I'm discussing here. So there is no debate that 20 families in the UK own the majority of agricultural land in the entire country, right? In the US, 100 families or 100 corporations do a lot of rent seeking from their positions in industries from oil to steel to now technology and advertising, of course. And the seven sister oil firms were essentially overtly a cartel. That's all well and good. But when you say the shadow government, it implies that we have a functioning government. I don't see that in the US. We are so past any kind of functioning institutions. The government cannot walk and chew gum. Do you know what I mean? It cannot make coherent policy towards the Houthi rebels in North Yemen. How do you address the fact that certainly the US and UK government seem to be less and less competent with each electoral cycle? The UN's ability to coordinate functions less well. Our ability to make coherent foreign policy seems to be eviscerated every 10 years. It's really decreased over the course of my lifetime. How can that exist at the same time as the idea of there being a shadow government?
It's going back to the question, Jason, of the degree of efficacy this type of a shadow government is capable of deploying right now. There's no doubt at all that with access to the internet and the cell phones and all of these things that are going on, these technological advances, the people ourselves are developing a much greater capacity to mobilize and organize. But the fact is, there's no doubt that the other group wants to maintain this kind of elite control over everything and making plans that we're becoming more and more effective in disrupting. What we have to be able to do is try to determine whether or not we can use this type of access to the new technology before they cut us off from it. And so we're pushing back successfully against them, but I'm hoping that we can evolve from a mere defensive pushback kind of operation against them to try to throw a wrench into their gears, a bit, to coming up with an affirmative coordinating ability to come forward with positive programs. We're working at the Institute trying to develop a positive program throughout the second administration of the Biden administration, when there's going to be a natural gravitation toward the more and more progressive end of the Democratic Party, because it's more pluralistic, it's more diverse, it's younger, et cetera. We're crafting together an entire government in waiting, a whole set of principles and policies and programs that are affirmative, that are upward, forward, positive programs. And I think that's what we're doing right now.
Very interesting. I just want to differentiate slightly your politics as I've come to understand them from those of the disorder program. What I heard from you was a very inspiring left-wing populist, optimistic, coordinated politics. I would say that what characterizes the disorder program is that we are center-left and anti-populist. We want international coordination, but veering to do so through traditional mechanisms, which may seem to your politics as being maybe more elite and not progressive enough. Now, to pivot away from this potential point of contention, although very interesting, just to wrap up with our listeners, I want to come full circle to the question of international coordination. Given that we're on the verge of this potentially disruptive but also enlightening knowledge, how do you think Congress and the institutions of the UAP board and others should deal with the release of this information? And how should we, as a civil society in allied nations, try to process and handle this information?
I think that the 64-page bill that was drafted by the Senate Intelligence Committee and Armed Services Committee proposing the UAP or UFO controlled disclosure campaign plan, to craft that plan and present it to the president and say, look, this is what we propose. We propose rolling out this information over a 7-year period to release it in a responsible and progressive way. And one of the roles of the New Paradigm Institute is going to be helping to prepare people for this. I think that's what we're going through here. The structures that were in place by the end of the Cold War were not working for most people on the planet, and that people knew it. And so the disruption of the functioning of those previous institutions and the ability of the United Nations to be continually governed by the United States that was in power at the end of World War II to set up this kind of hegemony over the world isn't working so well. You know, the political two-party system that's set up in the United States is not working so well to be able to provide the kind of apparent stability that was being provided before. The question you have to ask ourselves is, how well was that working for the people of the world? It wasn't. And so what we have to do is modify these structures. We have to modify them, and we have to do so by bringing in some of this information about the real place that we occupy in the galaxy.
After the break, what can aliens tell us about how to order the disorder? Well, Jason, that was certainly a really unusual interview. You covered a lot of ground there. I found myself not entirely convinced by all his points, but we should treat with real consideration some of the issues he raised. And it is the case that there was a genuine whistleblower who did testify at a hearing in Congress last year that there was a cover-up of the existence of intelligent life. So my first question to you is, do you think that whistleblower was a credible witness? Do you think there is some meat to this story?
As you said, I think very eloquently at the top of the program, from what we know about the available science, the chances of there being life somewhere in the universe seems rather high. The chance that it would get to the point of traveling thousands of light years to get to us, maybe it's not technically impossible, but seems not super likely, and that they would randomly lose 1 or 2 spacecraft and no one would see it and it could be easily covered up. It's getting less likely, But that's a different issue than the whistleblower story that I'm trying to cover here. And that's why I think we can separate Daniel Sheehan's politics from the underlying story, which is about how transparency works, how governments deal with information. And to my mind, the whistleblower story is credible that parts of the government have not shared various information with other parts of the government. I think of many historical analogies here. For example, when the India office backed an alternate claimant in Arabia in World War I to the Cairo office, they didn't share information with each other, even though they were parts of the British government. So this is just an example that different parts of our society and government fail to share information with each other, which to me, it makes me laugh, but it's also kind of tragic, no?
Your mention of the India office made me laugh a bit because when I first joined the Foreign Office, there was still a wall halfway through the building of the Foreign Office building on Whitehall, dividing what used to be the India office from what was the Foreign Office. And the wall still existed there for about the first 10 years of my time in the Foreign Office.
Why don't we have a great quote? Mr. Macmillan, tear down that wall.
Well, I think it was Mrs. Thatcher at the time that I was there. Mrs.
Even better,
Thatcher,
Reagan
tear
could
down
have
that
confronted
wall.
her and been like, Mrs. Thatcher, tear down that wall.
Yeah, well, now they're busy putting walls up again, sadly. So now it would be, let's rebuild those walls. But anyway, Jason, I know you've looked a lot into the background to this story as part of your preparation for your interview with Daniel. If there is really nothing to hide, why doesn't the government just come forward with whatever information it has? I mean, why is it still treating this with such secrecy?
This was the part that bothered me too, Alex. And here's what I've concluded. From the late 1940s to the present, the theory has gone as follows, that the technology from the non-human life forms, it was initially thought that we couldn't be public about it because if the Soviets didn't know about it and we told them, we would lose a competitive advantage. There's another wrinkle in recent reports, and to just draw on what Daniel Sheehan has written in the Liberation Times, and we're going to share that article in the show notes so that everyone can evaluate it on their own if they're interested. He alleges that certain defense contractors were given over the decades discrete aspects of UAP technology, like this part of a spacecraft or this part of an engine, and told to reverse engineer it and then submit contracts for procurement in competitions with DoD where they could get billion-dollar defense contracts if they're building things that are far advanced beyond existing human technology. So that is the thesis of his case. It also conveniently elides a motive for the Republican congressmen who want to block the UAP Disclosure Act's compelling implementation procedures, which has been headed by Representatives Mike Rogers, Mike Turner, and they're the chairs of the House's Armed Services Committee and Intelligence Committees, respectively. And the conspiracy or the thesis here goes that they're in districts with these exact defense contractors and that they get campaign contributions to make sure that none of these disclosures happen. And of course, I don't have any way to prove these theories. I have merely digested them through the writings of Mr. Sheehan and others.
Okay, so that leads very nicely on to a second theme that came out with your interview with Daniel, which is about, is there a deep state, or in his terminology, a shadow government that is manipulating all this information behind the scenes? Now, in the interview, you pushed quite hard on him. You tended towards the cock-up theory rather than the conspiracy theory. I mean, my own view is that there are certainly privileged elites who have access to decision makers or through their membership in special clubs like, say, the Bullingdon Club at Oxford for old Etonians. That does give them some kind of unique access and cliques and elites. But what about this idea of there being a deep state, a shadow government that's sort of really genuinely coordinating things beyond our formal level of government? What's your view on that?
This is a very important question because it's so au courant with what's going on in conspiracy theories and social media, right? I want to make 2 points here. One, there have always been elites. Two, that there are competing elites and those elites can't control government. Do you know what I mean? Government is a series of many different institutions and interests which are constantly disagreeing and fighting and not necessarily coordinating well with each other.
Well, I mean, I just don't believe in it simply from the fact that I've worked in government for so many years. And I know so many people who've worked in government. And I just feel like to be able to pull the wool over our eyes and have us all secretly being manipulated like puppets, it just is not realistic. But I also think there is a broader problem with government thinking they need to control information and that everything has to be classified. And sometimes classification is used because we are genuinely discussing national security matters and we don't want our adversaries to know our thinking on the latest issue. Sometimes we classify something because we're trying to protect a source. That source may not be saying anything that is particularly shocking or unknowable through public sources, but the very fact that we have a contact who is willing to talk to us off the record is something we need to protect. But a lot of time, it just becomes a habit to classify things. And actually, that can lead to public suspicion that the government is holding something back, is concealing something, that there's more there than there really is there, right?
100%. And you've not only made a great point here, but you've worded it in a way that people who are not in government may not have realized. A lot of absurdities are produced by the current system. I had my Fulbright in Syria, where I was spied on by the Syrian regime, of course, and I had people who went into my apartment and opened up my laptop when I wasn't there and things like that, right? Of course, when you have to get a job in the US government, they're like, do you have any friends in Syria? Have you ever interacted with the Syrian government? And the answer to those questions was yes. Do you know what I mean? And I'd been detained by the Syrian regime, as well as other things that happened to me. A lot of my peers who also had their Fulbrights in Syria could never get US security clearances. The irony is that Fulbright is a congressionally funded program that was established to create the expertise on foreign countries to serve the US government. But because you had been on a Fulbright in Syria, it's very, very difficult to then get a security clearance. Do you see the absolute absurdity of that, Alex? And I had an internship in the summer of 2004 at the US Embassy in Muscat, which is the capital of Oman. And for whatever reason, there was like a conspiracy at the embassy that there were neocon operatives. I believe that one of the reasons I was asked to leave the embassy was by looking at my bookshelf, I was accused of being a part of a cabal of conspirators, which is ironic because I was 23 and I was mostly just translating Arabic newspaper articles and I had very little idea of what was happening at the embassy.
I have a good story about trying to get US security clearance. My husband used to work as part of the US intelligence community. And when he was getting his security clearance revised, after we got married, I had to fill in endless questionnaires about who I was and my associations as well. And one of the questions that came back to me after my initial filling in the form, they asked me to list my occupation and career and everything. I promise you, this was a State Department security reviewer, came back to me and said, please, would you explain the nature and purpose of the Foreign Office? I had written that I was a British diplomat. And they're like, what is the nature and purpose of the British Foreign Office? It was unbelievable. So they do see reds on the beds everywhere.
It reminds me of the time that I flew back from Lebanon to the US, transiting in Paris or something. The security guard said, did you have any friends who were Lebanese? And I said, yes, I was living in Lebanon. And he said, were any of them Hezbollah guerrillas? And I said, no, none of my friends were Hezbollah guerrillas. And he said, but how would you know they were Lebanese? So although we digress, I want to just kind of sum up the relevance of this. The mere idea that the US government, particularly in coordination with our quote unquote allies, can work coherently to conceal information about UAPs in a multi-decade long process seems very unlikely. But there are parts of diplomacy governments must keep transparent. There are parts of diplomacy governments must not make transparent in order to be effective. If the US government knows that there has been non-human biologics on Earth and alien spacecraft, I think that people have a right to know so that it influences our not only spiritual way of thinking about the galaxy, but maybe could foster community that we need to all work together to deal with this challenge. And that's not the kind of thing that should be kept from people. So it's difficult to determine what those things are, but determining what that is requires functioning institutions. And that's why I wanted to have this episode, so we can debate, can our institutions function and make the right things transparent while keeping the correct things secret? That's it for this week. So if you too want to help order the disorder, tap follow right now. You'll be notified when every episode launches.
And we're on social media as well. Just search Disorder Show. And if you have any questions or want to comment on anything you've heard, you can email us at disordershow@gmail.com. And once every month or so, we'll be taking listeners' questions.
Yes, and I'm sure this is an episode to generate many listener questions. Can't wait for those. And if you want more background on, for example, the real evidence that there may be UAPs, please subscribe to our Substack now.
Our producer is George McDonough. Thank you, George. Our executive producer is Neil Fern.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you have an alien-free and orderly week.
Hello, Saul, David and Patrick Bishop here from the Battleground podcast. We wanted to give you all a heads up on what we've been up to on Battleground and the exciting places we're taking it.
Each Friday, we bring listeners a weekly insight into events in Ukraine, based on our joint expertise as historians and my experience as a war reporter, supplemented by frontline coverage from contributors in the field, as in the latest episode marking the second anniversary of the full-blown Russian invasion, which features a brilliant frontline dispatch from journalist Askol Krushelnitsky.
But that's not all. Midweek, since the start of the year, we've been delving back into the dramatic and epoch-making events of 80 years ago in Battleground 44. A fresh take on the battles, personalities, themes and controversies of this crucial period in World War II. This week, we're looking at the French Resistance, with episodes on the Eastern Front, the Great Escape, and much, much more to come, aided by input from some of the great historians of our age.
So if you want to hear truly informed and insightful news and analysis on the war in Ukraine, as well as our gripping Battleground 44 series, just search Battleground on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.